It's very much obvious that a major push for rethinking class design and overhauling classes is going to be needed in the expansion after Battle for Azeroth. The very future of the game depends on it. And I'm making these videos about class design now because I'm guessing Blizzard either is or soon will begin thinking about how to do that. While I like the customization progression and rewards associated with the Relic progression that I talked about in the last few videos, I don't think that'll be enough to make Holy Paladins fun and interesting. In this video, I'd like to go over some proposals and go in depth about the problems that I'm trying to solve, the pitfalls that I want to avoid while solving those problems, and why I'm proposing the solutions that I am. I'd like to say here that I tend toward inventing complete systems because, well, let's face it, no one ability exists in a vacuum, and one ability can affect how another is used, sometimes even simply by existing. That's why I keep coming up with things like complete rotations and complete relic trees, even when I know that Blizzard is unlikely to take all my ideas, and even in cases where I don't even want them to take all my ideas. Imagining a complete system lets Blizzard see how different aspects of the system interact and what the gaps are and aren't in those systems. I'm going to do something similar here, but it'll be for the class's overall kit, not for a system of customization that sits on top of that kit. Anyhow, on to the proposals. First of all, let's have a look at the rotation for Holy Paladins today on icyveins.com. As you can see, there's only about 3 or so active abilities that we use normally, and 2 or so similar that they're on the same line. And our group healing rotation is nearly identical to the single target rotation, partly because of the lack of group healing abilities in our toolkit. Another thing that's really bad about this is Light of the Martyr. I think we should talk about the history of this ability before I go on. Back during Warlords of Draenor, there were a lot of problems with Holy Paladins in that most of our heals felt the same. Word of Glory is the ability that eventually evolved into Light of the Martyr. Word of Glory was a holy power spender from Cataclysm that used to be an instant single target heal. But then rogues, warriors, and other melee specs complained to Blizzard, saying, "Why do we even have an interrupt on our spellbars when they don't stop Holy Paladins from casting heals like that?" So Blizzard gave Word of Glory a 1.5 second cast time in response to that. Just like Flash of Light, and just like Holy Radiance, and a lot like an infusion of light buffed Holy Light. So the heals felt pretty much the same. When Blizzard retooled the Holy Paladin spec going from Warlords to Legion, they took out Holy Power, which I didn't miss at the time due to the fact that all our heals felt the same, and at the time it felt like Holy Power was partly to blame for our heals all feeling the same. But the developers also wanted Holy Paladins to be mobile and to move to allies that they're healing. That mastery for Holy Paladins has its pros and its cons, but one of the things that they wanted was to add an instant heal that is costly to cast but that is usable while moving in a pinch. Light of the Martyr is that heal. It replaced Word of Glory, and unfortunately it's a situational button that we do not want to press unless we absolutely need to press it. Due to the fact that it doesn't copy healing to the beacon, obviously that's to prevent a Holy Paladin from blunting its damage by beaconing himself, it's mana inefficient in the long run, and in the short run it can bring the paladin one step closer to being dead because it costs health to cast. So it's highly situational, can save someone's life, but it's a button that you don't want to push in general. You remember how the relic progression was essentially a trick for adding new abilities without adding new abilities? Basically, with the relic progression I proposed, if you counted up the number of abilities on your spell bar before the relic progression and the number after the progression, they'd be about the same. But you'd still have access to abilities that you didn't have access before, so that's adding abilities without adding them. This is the reverse of that, removing an ability without removing it. Retooling Word of Glory into a button you almost never want to press, and never enjoy pressing when you do press it, means that the same number of buttons are on our spell bar as before, but one of them is mostly left out. You know, it may sound strange that I'm poo-pooing a situational ability here when I was talking about how getting situational abilities was so awesome just a few videos ago. But there is a major difference. The situational abilities I was talking about in those videos, like Denounce, Poison Nova, and Rebuke, are buttons that do something you like, or that you'll enjoy happening. This situational button does something that could kill you. So there are wrong ways to do situational abilities, and this is one of them. Given the boring, narrow rotation we've got, I think we should talk about returning to Holy Power and returning several abilities that we had before Legion rolled out. In fact, there are changes all the way back to Cataclysm that I'd strongly recommend reverting. Now, I realize Blizzard had their reasons for every change they've made, but given the lessons that we've learned about class design, given what worked then and what hasn't worked since, and above everything else, given the fun factor, I think we can selectively take aspects from previous expansions and apply them to Paladins today. Sorry to sound like an annoying, condescending consultant when I say this. I mean, I'm a software developer myself. I've had to deal with those kinds of consultants in the past, but I have to say it. It seems like you've lost sight of the single most important thing that anyone working on a game needs to keep in mind. Games are supposed to be fun. If you lose sight of that fact, then you have failed as a games developer. And with all the trimmed abilities and passives, the game isn't as fun as it's been. You absolutely need to optimize for the fun factor when designing this or any other game, and everything in this video is intended to help you optimize for the fun factor. The fun factor was optimal for Paladin's healing around Mists of Pandaria, and the fun factor was optimal for Holy Paladin's damage around Cataclysm, so those are the ones we should look into to get the best of both worlds. Before I begin with specifics, here are the problems I'm trying to solve. Healing is boring, soloing is boring, and we have weak group healing. But the problems aren't all that I'm paying attention to here. There are pitfalls as well. Pitfalls in this context are new or recurring problems that will or did come up if the design is bad. The pitfalls I want to avoid are falling into Warlords of Draenor's trap of having all the heals feel the same, Mists of Pandaria's trap of an unsatisfying Holy Power finisher while soloing, the melee feel going away, and the Mists of Pandaria and Warlord's trap of creating a spec that has no AoE damage buttons with short cooldowns. A potential pitfall is making Paladins too unmobile or too difficult to interrupt. Actually, I'm not sure whether too difficult to interrupt is still something that we want to avoid. If Paladins are going to be healing in melee, then they'll need some kind of protection from interrupts in PvP. Again, as I don't PvP myself, I have no idea how much protection is too much or how little is too little, but I can talk about some potential workarounds that can provide more or less interruption protection as it's needed. So my first proposal is to bring back Holy Power, including the old builders and finishers. Casting heals directly onto the beacon grants 1 Holy Power, casting Holy Shot grants 1 Holy Power, and casting Crusader Strike grants 1 Holy Power. Actually, having Crusader Strike act as a Holy Power builder would help to cement Holy Paladins as melee healers, as it would provide an easy way to build up a resource. I'd also bring back Holy Radiance as a group heal that grants a charge of Holy Power when you use it to heal. We're in pretty bad need of another group healing button, and I'd switch Light of Dawn back to a Holy Power finisher, as it was pretty satisfying style back in the day. For the single target healing Holy Power finisher, I'd go with Word of Mending. It's like Word of Glory, but it lets Retribution keep their talent. But there are several ways to implement Word of Mending to make it A, feel different from our other heals, and B, give it the exact amount of interrupt vulnerability that's needed. If we're in a scenario where the developers say, okay, Holy needs to be more interrupt proof than they are now, so let's make Word of Mending instant cast, then that's an option. But if we're in a scenario where the developers say, we still don't want Holy to be interrupt proof, then there's a way to do that while still keeping Holy Paladins mobile and keeping Word of Mending feeling different from our other healing spells. Make Word of Mending a channeled ability and make it castable while moving. This also has the potential to give us some good visuals. There were some channeled casts that NPCs were using during the Legion Paladin Order Hall class mount quest that would work great for this. So there's a lot of flexibility here depending on what we need, and it would be fairly easy to pivot from instant to channeled or from channeled to instant if necessary. To make soloing interesting, I think we need a holy power finisher along the lines of what Inquisition was back in the day. Something that gives us a buff that boosts holy damage dealt by a percentage, and that lasts longer when more holy power is consumed. Unless Blizzard specifically wants to give Holy Paladins some spiky burst damage as a piece of utility, they should not try to give us a direct damage Holy Power finisher, because one of the pitfalls of Mists of Pandaria was that the Glyph of Harsh Words ability that we'd had at the time barely dealt more damage than Holy Shock did. At a guess, Blizzard wanted to give Holy some kind of damaging Holy Power spender, but because we were healers, they did not want to make that spender deal too much damage. The end result was that our Holy Power spender was not satisfying to cast, so if Blizzard wants to create a big thing that goes boom damage finisher for Holy, then either they should go big with that or forget it and create an Inquisition-style finisher. I'd call the Inquisition-style finisher Word of Valor if it were up to me. Another thing that I've thought of to make this Word of Valor ability a bit more versatile is to add a caveat to Word of Valor that, while it's active, then the next interrupt, silence, or loss of control effect that hits you will not work, but it will consume Word of Valor in the process. This is if and only if Holy Paladins need more interrupt proofing. Now I know I have proposed a lot of interrupt proofing concepts over the last few videos, and I do not intend for all of them to be added at the same time. I'm spitballing them to provide a lot of options. I don't know which are optimal, which are overpowered, or how many are needed. I'll let Blizzard worry about that stuff. If you've watched my other videos, then you'll know exactly what's coming next. What Holy has needed ever since Legion is some kind of ranged damage ability with no cooldown. Denounce filled that gap during Warlords of Draenor and Mists of Pandaria, and Exorcism filled that gap during Cataclysm. And since Holy Power was actually worth spending for damage during Cataclysm, Crusader Strike was a regular part of my rotation back then too. So if Denounce or a similar ability were tacked onto the bottom of our current damage rotation while we had Holy Power, and a Holy Power consumer that was actually worth casting while soloing, then we'd have something very similar to our damage rotation from Cataclysm, and it would be much more fun than what we have now. We really need to have some kind of damage ability with no cooldown to fill in the gaps in our rotation, and I am so hoping, after 2 expansions in a row, to finally have that filled in. But there's more than one way to do that. Denounce looked cool and would look even cooler with the spellbook animation we have today. Exorcism sounded cool and would have better class flavor than Denounce, and it could be made to look as cool as Denounce looked. But a third option that's available, if Blizzard still has a phobia of adding too many new abilities, is to make Holy Radiance castable on enemies. Keep in mind, I am talking about a version of Holy Radiance similar to the Warlords of Draenor version. A timed cast AoE heal that has no cooldown. If that were castable on enemies, it would be terrific. And it would even fill in the other gap in our kits that was horrifically present in Mists of Pandaria and Warlords. I was complaining time and again from the end of Cataclysm to the start of Legion that we didn't have any AoE damage abilities with a short cooldown, and pining for Blizzard to re-add Consecration, which they did in Legion. If, and this is a big if, but if Blizzard feels afraid of adding new abilities to Holy Paladins without removing something else first, then in theory they could remove Consecration and replace it with a version of Holy Radiance that had no cooldown, could be cast on allies to do AoE healing, and that could be cast on enemies at range to do AoE damage. This would fill in the gap in Holy's kit of AoE damage and avoid the sucky, irritating pitfall of being a spec with no AoE damage abilities that have a short cooldown. Ask Disciplined Priests who played in Legion. It sucks not to have one. It would also fill in the gap in Holy Paladin's rotation and allow them to damage enemies while our other abilities are on cooldown. And it would give us another group healing button, which we desperately need. This version of Holy Radiance kills not 1, not 2, but 3 birds with 1 stone. It is hard to beat that. On top of that, Holy Radiance could be made to look just awesome visually. One of the things that I had been looking forward to in Mists of Pandaria was that for a while, Blizzard was going to have Holy Wrath be Holy's main nuke. At the time, it hurled a volley of holy bolts at the enemy, and I'd been looking forward to having a volley of holy bolts graphic ability. I mean, the graphics on that would be so cool. Mages would be jealous of how we looked. If Holy Radiance were an AoE damage ability with a volley of holy bolts, whew boy, mages probably would be jealous. Unless, of course, Blizzard makes Fireball Volley and Frostbolt Volley into end of tree relic abilities for mages, but well, that's another story. Of course, there's another pitfall. Holy Radiance probably shouldn't generate holy power when it's used to damage enemies, since it would be a source of holy damage while Word of Valor was active. In a way, it would be a holy power spender if Word of Valor boosted our holy damage specifically. So it shouldn't generate holy power at the exact time we're trying to spend holy power. All of what I just said about how awesome Holy Radiance would be is under the assumption that Blizzard is still reluctant to try adding abilities to players' spellbars. Personally, I think they shouldn't be afraid to add stuff to players' spellbars, but there are ways to give players fun and interesting playstyles, even if Blizzard still has that reluctance. Now, the very act of giving paladins an ability that Crusader Strike can build up to, even before taking talents into account, would help to preserve paladins' melee feel. It would be worth getting into melee to build up free or cheap holy power charges for use with Word of Mending or Light of Dawn. Adding Rebuke back for Holy would also help to keep Holy Paladins' melee feel, and it would provide more utility and more incentives to be in melee. Keeping Consecration around would also further cement this. Consecration is actually a pretty decent filler ability for Holy Paladins because it has no mana cost, so I'd prefer it if we could keep it. Swapping Consecration for this triple threat Holy Radiance is only a good idea if Blizzard has that spell-adding phobia, which I hope they've gotten over by now, so they can add things like Holy Radiance or Denounce without feeling the need to remove anything else. The pitfalls to be avoided in the end are the pitfalls they fell into in Mists and Legion. In Mists, the pitfall was that Holy Paladins had no AoE damage, and in Legion the pitfall was that Holy Paladins lacked a damage ability with no cooldown. When we get reworked after Battle for Azeroth, Blizzard, please don't fall into those traps again. There are a few other things that are important to be done with Holy. For example, we could use more passives to make things interesting. One of the things that made Legion more fun, even after all the trimming, was the passives that the Silver Hand gave us. The power of the Silver Hand, boosting Holy Shock's effect once in a while, is one example. Sacred Dawn giving us more healing to our Dawn targets is another example. When we lost our artifact weapon, those passives went out the window, and didn't really get replaced with anything else. Also, we lost some playstyle customization when Beacon of the Lightbringer was removed from our talent grids. Probably the developers are thinking to themselves, filling in the gaps artifact weapons left? Customization? Isn't that what Azerite traits are supposed to do? Sorry, but they just don't fill those gaps in. Anyhow, since we need some more procs and passes to shake up our playstyle, and since we miss Beacon of the Lightbringer, I'd recommend making Holy's version of Divine Purpose baseline for the spec, probably renaming it to Daybreak or something, and then putting Beacon of the Lightbringer in Divine Purpose's place. Probably you should change Infusion of Light so that it can stack to accommodate potential Holy Shocks happening in a row, because with that baseline it could happen. So that's the kind of healing and damage kit that I'd like to see Holy Paladins have after Battle for Azeroth. There have been times in the past being a Holy Paladin was more fun than it is today, and I tried to learn lessons from those eras and apply them to today in order to put forward the best ideas I could. While bringing back Holy Power isn't the only way to make Holy Paladin healing fun and interesting again, it's a way that'll appeal to veterans and rookies alike, and it's got a lot of potential. Whatever happens, we need a major overhaul in the next expansion, and re-adding Holy Power delivers on that. Before I close this video out, I'd like to propose an idea for the Blizzard developers to keep in their heads that'll keep their goals for class design in perspective. Imagine if they planned to make a game trailer on YouTube for every spec in the game. That's right, one for every single one of the 36 specs in the game, meant to show off the visuals and new capabilities coming to that spec in the next expansion, and that was intended to impress players, i.e. Blizzard's paying customers. If everything the developers do to the game keeps that trailer and that goal to impress in mind, then things are much more likely to get better instead of worse. Because then they'll be asking themselves, how can we make the players happy? How can we make this awesome? It kind of seems like they haven't been asking themselves those questions, judging from the state of Battle for Azeroth, and I'm hoping oh so much that they finally do get around to fixing Battle for Azeroth's issues, especially the issues with class design. I think that on some level, the Blizzard developers realize that the future of the game hinges on that, and if they keep the specs trailer in mind every step of the way, then they will be able to fix it.